We're going to talk about the skull. Uh, so the skull actually has two sets of bones in it. Uh, Really, it's fairly artificial that we consider these two sets. But basically, we subdivide the skull into the two parts. One part is the part that encloses the brain, that actually comes into contact with the brain, and that's called the cranium. Uh, There's a cranial vault, which is the roof, and the cranial base, which consists of three fossa, anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. Uh, they they're there to protect the brain. They also provide sites of attachment for muscles, muscles of your neck and etc. All happen through the cranial bones. The other set of bones is the facial bones, and they make up the framework of the face. Now, it's interesting, cranial trumps facial. So there's a number of bones that contribute to the shape of the face, but are considered cranial because they actually touch the brain. So really, it's these ones don't come in contact with the brain. This is where your eyeballs are, your nose, mouth. Right? So this muscles of facial expression, etc. There. So when we look at these bones of the skull, they all come together at special joints called sutures. Now, most of the sutures are named for the bones that are on either side of the suture, with the exception of a couple of them. The suture that joins the occipital bone here to the parietal bones here is the lambdoid suture. The one that does the parietal bones to the temporal bone here is the squamous suture. The one that does the parietal bones to the frontal bone here that runs across the top of your head is the coronal suture. And we're going to see that the two parietal bones join together at the sagittal suture, which is right along here, that runs in a sagittal plane. This runs in the coronal plane. Squamous means flat, so this is in the flat part of the bone. Lambdoid means the letter lambda, which is like an upside down L, and we'll see it in a second. When we look at the base of the cranium, you'll see that up in your forehead, it's fairly shallow. It's called the anterior cranial fossa. There's a slightly deeper one called the middle cranial fossa, and then down in the base of the skull is the posterior cranial fossa. So what are the bones that are in the cranium? There's the frontal bone, which is your forehead and the top of your orbits, the top of your eyeballs. The parietal bones, which are on either side. There's the occipital bone, which is the base of your skull, the back end. The temporal bones are on either side, and that houses the organs of hearing. Your ears are in there. The sphenoid and the ethmoid bone make up the floor and become really kind of the key that joins the face to the cranium. We'll look at them in detail in a second. So the frontal bone is this anterior portion. It's the anterior cranial fossa, and like I said, the superior walls of the orbits. They have spaces in it called sinuses, and that would therefore be the frontal sinus. So it's the yellow. Now, one of the things you're going to see in your book and throughout these slides is that the colors stay consistent. So each color is for a different bone, and it's consistent throughout all the views. So in this case, the frontal bone is this kind of goldy yellow. The rest of these are facial bones, but the nasal bones are that dark blue. The zygomatic bone is the light blue. Maxilla is that mauvey purple. The sphenoid bone is kind of the fuchsia, where the parietal bone is kind of a pink up here. You'll notice that the sphenoid bone actually makes it out to the outside right there. And again, this is to try and help you orient. Any of the little holes are called foramen. Foramen means hole, and they really are named for where they are. So this is the infraorbital foramen, which means the hole below the eye. This is the mental foramen, which means the holes in the chin. The parietal bones are involved with the 4 sutures that I just mentioned, the coronal, sagittal, lambdoid, and squamous sutures, and they basically make the roof of the skull. They're here. Okay. This orangey one is the temporal bone, but the parietal bone is here. The occipital bone is this one here, and it goes right to the back. Now, it also is the part that articulates with the first vertebrae. It's not only does it form the back part of the skull, it also forms the majority of the floor of the skull and actually surrounds the foramen magnum, the big hole. It looks like this. There are various lines on it. We call them nuchal lines, which means neck muscle lines, superior and inferior nuchal line. There's a protuberance is here. That's palpable as something that's quite large, the external occipital protuberance. Which brings me to a point. If something is called the external occipital protuberance, then there must be an internal, or else they would only just call it the occipital protuberance. So whenever you see something named like that, an inferior nuchal line must mean there's a superior nuchal line. So it's like this. Now, most people know that this is the occiput. This is where the occipital lobe of the brain sits. But what most people don't realize is that it extends all the way up here, and it actually goes right to your nose. It's it goes all the way along the base of the skull. This big hole here is the most important big hole. It's the only one that I'm going to actually probably test you on. It's called the foramen magnum, and that's where the spinal cord exits. The temporal bones are interesting bones. They're very irregular. There's 4 parts to it. There's the squamous part, which is flat. The tympanic part, which is where the eardrums are found. There's the mastoid part, which is mast means breast, so it's the breast-shaped part. And there's the petrous part, which petrous means rocky. So it looks like a little mountain range inside. So from the outside, it looks like this. So there's the mastoid process. Important place for muscular attachment. Styloid process here. Stylo is a pen, so it's a pen-like process. This is the external auditory meatus or acoustic meatus. This is where your ear canal goes. Your eardrum sits right back in there. So this whole area that surrounds that is called the tympanic region. This spot right here is called the mandibular fossa. That's where the temporal mandibular joint is. That's the TMJ, the joint of the jaw. This becomes part of your cheekbone. It's called the zygomatic process because it joins with the zygomatic bone right here. And it makes your cheekbone. And this is the squamous region. You have to go inside to see the petrous region. The petrous region is this part here. And it looks like a little mountain range, and that actually encases the inner ear. This is where the cochlea and the semicircular canals, the organs of hearing and balance, are found. That hole here is the internal acoustic meatus because that's where the acoustic nerve passes through. Meatus means tunnel-like thing. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the sphenoid bone next, but the sphenoid bone is this bone here. It's the pink one. This part here of the sphenoid is called the sella turcica. Its job is to protect the pituitary gland. The rest of the sphenoid bone has wings. These are the lesser wings. These are the greater wings. It's kind of shaped a little bit like a butterfly. Now, there are also two plates called the pterygoid plate. Pterygoid means wing. So there's the greater wing, the lesser wing, and the wing. It's the keystone. It articulates with all the other cranial bones, and it has a big connection with the face. So it kind of holds everything together here. This is pronounced pterygoid. The P is an aid for pronunciation. Pterygoid. So it looks like this when you look down on it. Sella turcica, lesser wings, greater wings. There's the body. There's a sinus in the body called the sphenoid sinus. And there are things that hang down. When you look at it from front on, or this is from the back, looking forward, there's the body. The sella turcica is here, lesser wing, greater wing, and these are the pterygoid processes, the wings. The ethmoid bone is quite an elaborate bone, and in class I will actually demonstrate it if somebody brings it up. It's probably easier to see in 3 dimensions, so I'll take a minute in class and do it. But it provides the passageways for the nose. It looks like this. Air passes through here. Right. These are all sinuses. This makes up the lateral side of the nasal passage, but the medial side of the orbits. So this is the wall between your eyeballs and your nose. This is the bony part of the nasal septum. It separates the air passages into 2. It's called the perpendicular plate. Up at the top, there's a little thing called the crista galli, which means the crest of the rooster. It's the only place that the brain is actually attached. It's the anchoring point for the brain. And on either side of the crista galli, there's this bone with holes in them. And that's called the cribiform plate, because it looks just like a crib board. There's little holes. And through the holes is where the olfactory nerve goes, so the sense of smell happens at the top of this. We'll get to the conche later. So it's actually way back in here. Right? So that's the ethmoid bone. If you look at it here, it's this. Okay, so there's the crista galli, and there's the cribiform plate on either side. This is the only part that's cranium. Everything else is part of the face, but it makes it a cranial bone. There are other little irregular shaped bones called sutural bones. They vary from person to person. It's just that the suture ends up making that little bone a separate bone. Not that big a deal.